Hello, it's Professor Buzzkill, one of the best history podcasts out there, and certainly the best history podcast that busts myths and takes its names. You know, we almost never talk about medieval subjects on this show anymore, and the Middle Ages is so important, and it's so important in people's perceptions of history that's been a real problem, and I've been wanting to address that for a long time. Fortunately for all of you, we have on the line via the internet, all the way from the Netherlands, Hedwig Teeuwisse, who is known to almost all of you out there, especially those of you on social media, as the fake history hunter. Hello, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you.
You know, I'm having a run of guests on the show who do my job better than I do. We've had recently the author of the great history myth smashing series called History Smashers, talking about the Titanic and talking about Christopher Columbus. And now we have you here talking about the Middle Ages, and your new book is out.
It is, yes.
It has just appeared. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. And we're so happy you're here, not only because we need to talk about these medieval myths, but because it's great to talk to someone who takes myths apart and shows how they're wrong. Let me ask you first, before we start, what's it like at parties on continental Europe when you have to tell people say something, oh, blah, 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 and you say, well, actually, no, medieval people didn't have terrible teeth.
I think it's adorable that you think I get invited to parties.
I think you do get invited to a lot of parties. Whether you get re-invited is another story.
No. I'm not a party animal, and I haven't been invited to one for a very long time. But not because I keep harassing people about history. I have some self-control, although I must admit I've nearly gotten into fist fights over history subjects. But that was usually in pubs. I'm not the parties I go to are generally parties where everyone is obsessed with history. So everyone's just as bad as I am over there, so that's fine.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Well, there is a sense in which people do get upset when their conceptions of history are overturned, or we attempt to overturn their conceptions of history when those conceptions are incorrect. And as you and I were talking in our sort of negotiations with our lawyers and everything and all our agents before booking you on the show, in general, why do you think there are so many myths about European medieval history, but also myths that sort of make it so that you look down on medieval people as dirty and filthy and backward and unhealthy and all that sort of stuff?
I think there's several reasons for it. I think at its core, we have this chronological snobbery where we all like to pretend and believe that we are better than our ancestors, that those who came before us, that, that there is always this straight line of progress, that we are the top of creation, that sort of thing. For some people, it is just really difficult to accept that perhaps not everything was as bad as we want to believe. And that perhaps some things were better than they were and than they are now. People really don't like hearing that because it makes, it has a hint of life is futile. We're not going anywhere. We're running in circles. So I sort of get it. But on the other hand, it's also something that we may have based a big part of our life on. We were taught these things in school. And, if one thing that we were taught in school is not true, maybe nothing we were taught in school is not true. And, there are lies being taught about the Middle Ages in museums and castle tours and things like that. And not to mention Hollywood, television and things like that. So, if everyone is telling you that something is true and then some annoying person on the internet says, well, actually, corrects you, I understand that a lot of people automatically go into defense mode. Like, what do you mean? Who are you? You're wrong. Everyone else says it's true. So, there are a lot of reasons.
Well, I think it's so important what you said about, medieval castle tours and museums and places that seem like they automatically would be, places of authority. These people are expert.
Know, yeah.
If I'm going to X castle to hear about X castle, the tour guides are going to tell me the truth about what life was like for people who lived in that castle.
Yeah, but what they're not always, but what some of them are simply doing is repeating what they were told. And what they were taught is sometimes no longer true. I mean, it's not like they're doing it on purpose. And, many of these guides are simply telling the story that has been true, assumed to be true for decades. So, don't get too angry with the castle guides. Historians, their job is to keep researching things and finding new evidence, and then, if need be, change what we think we know. So not everyone is up to date with what we know.
Right. As we keep saying, new stuff comes to light. There literally are new discoveries, even about ages as old as the Middle Ages and even older than that.
No, I mean, that's the annoying and also a wonderful thing about history, is that on one hand, it never changes. And on the other hand, what we know about it changes all the time. So if someone says, I got this from a book, the first question I ask is, when was the book written? Because people have tried to change my mind with books that were written 120 years ago. And before certain archaeological things were even found, before we had DNA, not that all those books are now worthless, but it is often the first clue that someone, might perhaps be a little bit behind.
Well, but it does bother me. People are willing to accept new information from scientists and medical researchers. And, we're finding new things about stars and pulsars and new things about the rings of Saturn. Oh, and people will take that automatically, but if you take that as true automatically, but if you'd say we're finding new things, literally new things that haven't been discussed before about Lady Godiva, they can say, well, what do you mean? No, that can't be true. History is the past and that's over. It doesn't change.
Yeah, that happens all the time. But I must disagree that it's not just history, because as we can see, especially with COVID, medical experts who know what they're talking about, we're no longer believing them either, and we're no longer believing teachers, we're no longer believing politicians, which is probably a good idea. But there's this massive level of not believing anyone if they say something you don't want to hear. Maybe that's just human nature, I don't know, but thanks to the internet, I think that is getting out of hand.
Well, we seem to be in a very bad period of people not believing experts, especially in medicine and science. And
yeah, and
very, very
thanks to the internet, you can pretty easily find people who agree with you, even if you're wrong.
Yeah,
and then if you find 1,000 people who all say, pyramids were actually built upside down,
yeah.
If there are 1,000 people who also believe that, you're going to be strengthened in that idea. They're going to bring photoshopped images, and you're going to go, ooh. And you're going to think you're part of some sort of special group who knows something nobody else knows. You have to be strong to rise above that sort of thing.
Well, let's dive right into what I think of as myths about medieval health. And I think the first of these is that it in your book is a whole chapter. Terrible teeth. We get the impression of that medieval people is that their teeth were all black. We see Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Everyone has missing teeth and blackened teeth and everything. That makes sense to us. That's normal to us. But it's much more interesting and that's less true than we think.
But it fits our idea of the era. We have this certain image, and bad teeth is a big part of that. And we see Hollywood movies and television shows where they spend a lot of time and money and effort into making all the teeth of everyone in the film look terrible, and even blacking them out. You've got no teeth. And it makes very little sense. I mean, of course, people didn't have the dental, professionals that we have today, and, they couldn't completely replace their teeth if they were really wonky. They didn't have that, but they also didn't have teeth that were as much under attack as they are today. We have lots of refined sugar, starch, caffeine, tobacco. We are attacking our teeth every single day. Medieval people didn't have all those things. They didn't have all those ingredients. They weren't part of their diet. Their teeth were generally pretty good condition, and they did look after them. They brushed them. We even have recipes for whitening them. People cared about their teeth, and of course they did, because it changes how you look and it changes your odds of getting a kiss. And for some reason, people since the dawn of time have really liked kissing. So, you can analyze a lot of history that comes down to the fact that people like to be loved. And then suddenly a lot of things that people are saying no longer make sense, because humans are at their core haven't changed much over the thousands of years. We still want the same. We want to be happy. We want to have a comfortable bed. We want nice food. We want, people to like us, things like that. If you look at it like that, suddenly the idea that people everywhere didn't care about their teeth and they were falling out It makes no sense. And we know this is true because also a lot of archaeological work, we found lots of medieval skeletons. And I'm not saying their teeth were as good as, as you see in Hollywood these days, on movie stars and things. They weren't super glow in the dark white, but they had decent teeth, better teeth than came after, contact with the Americas, when sugar became a bigger part of our diet here in Europe, and the coffee and the tobacco and all those things started adding up. Victorian teeth were a lot worse than medieval teeth.
Yeah.
And, but this is something that fits the image that we have of a certain era. So we reinforce it. We use it to set a theme. When you make a film, you give everyone black and bad teeth. It's that simple, but it's wrong.
Well, you also give them bad health. Medieval health seems to be always bad. Every in medieval film, not only is there filth running down the street and there's mud everywhere, but every other person is missing a leg or is on some medieval crutch or has a hunchback or, it's and on and on and on. It seems like, well, how did any of these people ever conduct wars or build huge cities?
Yeah, exactly.
If they were so unbelievably unhealthy.
Yeah, and of course, health was nowhere like it is today. But you can say that about pretty much every era up till, let's say, 50 years ago. Or let's be generous, a generation or two ago. But when we show this in films and television, somehow, when we have something set in ancient Rome or in the 17th century or the Renaissance or whatever, suddenly they don't do that. It's not the image we have of that era. Ancient Roman cities were disgusting. They had health problems. They had an epidemic of the plague that everyone also keeps forgetting about. They had problems with waste and all that sort of thing. But somehow, except in really good shows, that was not the image we have, so you didn't see it. We like to pile that all onto the Middle Ages. Although Victorian London also gets that a little bit. We really, really love Victorian slums with, people with crutches and throwing things out a window and being all poor and sad and coughing all the time, which is probably a bit more realistic. But, somehow we want to reinforce an image that we got from somewhere.
Well, I think it's so fascinating because of the love for classical life and the sort of elevation that we put Roman life and Greek life on, that we all think it's all clean and all the stone and all the beautiful architecture and everything's perfect. And the Romans are famous for their sewers and all kinds of, in the sense of being efficient sewers and things like that. And Roman streets are clean. And then the world went south.
Yeah. Roman Empire collapsed instead of slowly withdrawing and changing.
Right.
And everyone, 10 minutes after the Romans left, everyone went like, yay, party time. Let's throw our clothes in the mud and let's go sit in a puddle all day and poke each other in the eye and do nothing for a couple of decades. It is so weird. It's so strange. Part of that is Renaissance propaganda. We're dealing with stories that are centuries old. Late medieval Italians were already moaning about how things used to be better in the olden days and how, and we're still dealing with that.
Well, I think the biggest indicator of this is the idea that everyone died when they were 15, 25 years old.
Yeah.
In medieval times. That's the classic, the poor life expectancy.
Yeah, and that is a problem that's not just for the Middle Ages, but with statistics in general. We have that with any statistic about any era, I think, but the one with the Middle Ages sticks again because it fits our image. But that low number includes childbirth and child death, so it goes down really rapidly because a lot of children died, and that is true, that is a fact, and that brings down the average dramatically. But if you change the statistic and you say, okay, we're going to look only at people who survived childhood, then suddenly it changes amazingly, and you have people living into their 60s, which is not that dramatic a change from, let's say, a generation or two ago. And that, again, changes the entire perspective. Of course, a lot of people died young. A lot of people died, especially women, died young as well, because they were involved in childbirth. We're not saying that everyone lived a happy, long life. We're not, balance isn't going the other way. But the idea that people all died young, and that's also the reason why they all married young and had babies young, that's just not true. That's just silly.
Yeah. We've busted the life expectancy myth before and stressed the infant mortality aspect of it. But what we haven't stressed on this show really is the young women dying in childbirth. If you die in childbirth when you're 25, that also brings the average down.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
again, the average is correct over the entire span of life years, but when you take those things into account, it wasn't uncommon at all to see people in their 60s
No,
walking around
no.
this filthy medieval town that we believe,
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, we also think because of people dying young, that people married young, and that's also not true. We see a lot of people marrying in their late teens or early 20s, which is in some places in the world that's later than it is now. And medieval people knew that if you married and tried to have babies when you were a child yourself, the risks were a lot higher. And oddly enough, medieval people didn't want to die. Shocking news. But
Yeah.
they knew that if you marry a 12-year-old girl and then have a baby, the risks of her surviving that are pretty slim. Things are getting, it becomes a lot more dangerous. But the common people, poor people, they also wanted to prepare for marriage life. They didn't want to go, oh, I'm 12, let's get married. They wanted to have some money saved up. They wanted to have a career to look forward to. The idea that young people in medieval Europe would leave home and go to another place to learn and to earn money and to work, that is also something that really doesn't fit the image people have of that era. They just assume that people stayed in their house with their 32 children, and then the second they were old enough, they'd throw them out the door and someone would marry them. But
Right.
being a young medieval person living in a town away from your parents, working and earning money and being up to a certain level free, having a bit of freedom, that's an image we have from relatively recently. That's modern life almost. That's also an image that doesn't fit. And just because it doesn't fit what we want to believe, people automatically have this thing of, I don't believe it. It's not true.
Yeah. Well, the other biggie is sort of medieval ignorance, that no one in medieval Europe could read. No one knew anything about the world outside their little village or their little street or anything like that. Again, you show, and lots of other people have shown, that this is shockingly untrue.
Yeah, for a very long time, the percentage of people who were literate in medieval Europe has been 1%. People have said it was 1% of the people could read and write. These days, historians say it's probably more to 10%, perhaps higher. But the fact is that we have no idea. We have no idea. There is, unfortunately, no medieval person was kind enough to go door to door and ask people, can you read or write? And, keep records of that. The only thing we know about people who could read and write is because we have books that survived all this time and legal documents. What common people wrote, love letters, shopping lists, all those sort of things, those didn't survive because, they were not written on expensive parchment. They were written on bark, on bone, on wood. And most of that all vanished. So I can't prove this, but I think literacy was much higher, partially based on all the writing that we find, which is mostly a lot of it is by common people. We actually have medieval love letters, I love you, you love me, let's get married, that sort of thing, or tell dad to bring me a sweater. We have letters like that. Students complaining about their lodgings. Those things do exist, but because the way it was written down, so much of it has not survived that I like to think, and again, I say I have no evidence for this, so I might be completely wrong. I think that a lot more people could read or write than we think, and they were taught the basics probably at home. Just if your parents have a shop, you need to know a little bit of maths, and if you know a little bit of maths, it's really easy to know, how do you write your name? That's how it starts. I think a lot of people knew a little bit more about reading and writing than we think. But at least it's more than the 1% than people have been saying for a while. It's now 10%. And maybe if we discover something new, we can change it. But it's all guesswork because, again, there's no way of knowing until someone finally gets me my time machine.
Yeah. But also there's this strange notion, and thankfully people really don't say this much anymore, that after the fall of Rome, Europe plunges into, quote, the Dark Ages, and that there's a dip, there's a decline in literacy, there's a decline in health, there's a decline, in fact, in civilization, right, after the Roman Empire is gone, and then that continues to decline and stays at a very low level until, as you say, the Renaissance suddenly saves everything and everybody and brings it back up to the previous level.
Yeah, an interesting detail is that medieval Europe had several renaissances, and the first happened in the seventh century, which is, like 10 minutes after the Romans left. Yeah, it's complicated because how do you define decline? Yes, the Roman oppressor, or, as I like to call them, the evil colonist empire, they left large parts of Europe, and then people had to adapt to change. And in some parts, that was dramatic because, the Romans built cities where lots of people lived and with lots of trade and traffic and things like that. And that dried up. Again, not in one afternoon, but that took decades, sometimes centuries even. Those cities had to adapt. They no longer had all those people visiting. So for them, it was dramatic. But does that mean things got worse? Is it worse? Has your life become worse when you no longer go to a bathhouse that is made with all these lovely tiles and warm floor, and where you sit in a bath with 50 other people while poor slaves outside are working their skin to the bone, their hands to the bone? Is that worse or better than you going to a medieval bathhouse where you can sit in a tub with 2 people or 3 people with your neighbors and have a little chat? When you get clean, you have your bath. Of course, when you look at it superficially, that is not, things got worse. But in practicality, life, has it really gotten worse? In some ways, things got worse. Some things got better. But if you say that is an absolute overall decline of civilization, that is sort of more of a personal thing. And I think that really depends on you. If you are going to drink from a simple clay jug or from a fancy clay jug, that's a decline, but does it really matter? Does it make your life really worse?
Right.
I don't think so. No, if you don't need these fancy Roman roads because you no longer have these, soldiers marching up and down it all day, all these carts with all their trade, does it matter that the road is not maintained if you don't need it, if you no longer use it? Well, I don't know. No matter how you look at it, I don't think it's enough to call centuries of history dark ages. And there weren't no darker than before or after. There was a time of adaptation and perhaps a bit of chaos in parts of Europe. Large parts of Europe barely even noticed a change for a very long time. So it's a controversial title.
Yeah, well, like I say, I almost never hear it anymore, and that I think is a good sign in itself.
Historians have been,
but certainly for the longest time, people have said that.
I have to admit, it's a very good word, a term, phrase, dark ages. It sounds so good.
Yeah.
But historians have been trying to get rid of it since the 1930s, I think, even earlier. We know some of it was dark, some of it was light, and we can say that about pretty much every part of history, even today. So calling centuries dark it's a judgment, it's an emotional term. It's not a scientific, logical term.
Yeah, and it was always plunging into the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages fell across Europe. It's all this dramatic language.
I love the idea of it happening suddenly. It's not how it happened, but it's such a funny visual. I really like to imagine that really happened because it makes me laugh every time. People just walking around going, "How are you doing? Yes, okay, let's have lunch." And oh no, the Dark Ages. All right, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, I had plans for this afternoon, but I guess those are cancelled now.
Yeah, the Dark Ages are here now.
Let's stop doing whatever we were doing.
Yeah, there's an alarm on my iPhone telling me the Dark Ages start in 15 minutes.
Oh, man.
Well, you mentioned drinking out of clay vessels a second ago, and that reminds me of one of the big myths. I think, by the way, Buzzkill, is again 101 of these. Number 96 is drinking beer instead of water because the water was so impure.
Yeah, that's a classic. People really don't like me correcting that one. But and this is going to sound shocking to some people, but humans need water. They need it.
Right. Yeah.
And they've always needed it. Medieval people perhaps needed it even more than others. That is where they built their villages and their communities near clean drinking water. They needed a source. They needed a river, a canal. They needed a fountain. They needed a spring. They needed clean water to drink, to wash, but also to make their ale with. As any good brewer can tell you, is you need clean water to make good beer and ale. It doesn't work if you use polluted water. The beer is not going to be any good. It's a very clinical almost process. It's a chemical process. You have to put all these ingredients together, and you've got to boil and do this and that. And you can't just go and get some random water and throw it in and hope it turns into a nice beer. And everyone was making beer. I mean, don't get me wrong, beer and ale were a huge part of the diet back then. People drank loads of it, and most of it very low alcohol percentage. So yes, children also drank it. But it's because it's nice. It tastes better. It's also very nutritious. It has lots of ingredients that help you through the day. And if your food has to be prepared on an open fire, sometimes you don't have time for that. You just want if you have a good ale, you can drink that, and you've got everything you need to work for a while. So that's why people drank the beer. If the water was polluted, people got upset. We literally have records of people saying that river is dirty, we need to do something about it, or my neighbor has polluted my well and I've no longer got any clean water. Go beat his face in.
Yeah.
People really needed and wanted clean water. And if they didn't, they got upset. And another funny thing is that we know that the Romans had aqueducts. People go on and on about the Roman aqueducts. They won't shut up about it. But very few people know that the medieval people also had aqueducts and conduits and canals. And they had this massive, complicated, sophisticated systems of buckets automatically almost dragging water out of wells and bringing it to towns. And there were fountains with clean water in cities that were pumped in from the countryside, and that's pretty amazing. And I recently asked my followers on Twitter, I said, listen, if you know of a medieval place that had its own clean water supply, let me know and I'll make a list. And I've got this very long list now that is even surprising me. I'm going, really, blimey, I didn't know that. Little villages even, and often towns and cities, and it's fantastic. And something that they even could do is that during very special events, they would do something to the conduit, that it would bring wine to the fountain instead of clean water. And and no matter how advanced our drinking systems are today, that's not going to happen for us, is it?
No,
they're not going to bring beer or water or wine to our houses today. So that was quite that's what I call a decline.
Yeah, well, I think that's very important, showing that there was clean water, because in order to make clean water, in order to make the beer that people think everybody lived on instead of water, you had to have clean water.
Yeah.
And also there were all these, extensive records from medieval landowners, medieval princes, and, they seemed to be obsessed with the necessity of their residents' food and water supply. We think of them all rushing off to the Crusades and fighting each other all the time and whatever, but actually, almost all the time, they're concerned with the condition of their people.
Yeah, if your village or town or city or community or whatever had only one water source, and it got polluted, by the time you returned from the Crusades, there would be nobody left. People would be dead or living somewhere else, and you'd no longer have an income from your tenants. So it was very important, and people, they were not stupid. If Charlie had a drink from the puddle that smelled and looked weird, and he then keeled over and died, people were no longer going to drink from that puddle. People knew when to drink what or when. Their lives depended on it, and they made sure that if they had a river for waste, where they could throw all their waste in, which they often had, that they would keep that as far away from their river with clean water that they drank from, because they wanted to drink it. People are so confused by medieval people being like humans, being normal. That really confuses them. Medieval people didn't want to die. What? What's wrong with them? Why didn't they just drink the mucky water and died, like I've seen on television? It's weird.
Well, that brings up another really weird thing that is almost it's usually a Victorian thing, and you're talking about medieval people not wanting to die, and certainly medieval people didn't want to be tortured, but yet we have every carnival show in the 18th and 19th century, every carnival show in the 20th century seems to have depictions of and examples of medieval torture devices.
Oh, yeah, they love them.
And we've done a little show on this, but your chapter on this is so much better than what we did. Tell us about the sort of truth value in the medieval torture devices belief.
Well, quite a few of those torture devices are complete fantasies. They're just made up.
And by the way, not made up by people in the Middle Ages.
No. They were, as is often the case, something the Victorians made up.
Yeah.
They were obsessed with the Middle Ages, which, I can't blame them. But when they then heard a story or misunderstood a story and started to embellish it, and started to talk about it, for instance, the Iron Maiden, people started talking about that, the idea of being locked in a box with spikes and then you slowly bleed to death, which is really awful. And interestingly enough, when people first started writing about that, they didn't have them. Nobody had ever seen one. There weren't any of them anywhere. But the second book started being published, mentioning the Iron Maiden and people writing about it in the media and chatting about it. Suddenly there were all these antique collectors who said, oh, one of those. Yeah, I've got one in the basement. Didn't I tell you? I forgot to tell you that? Oh, wow, what a coincidence. Yeah. And then a museum got one and put it in their collection. And then all the Victorians who, as you know, they have this image of being prim and proper and civilized, which also is a bit of fake history, but they sure love their sex and violence and all that sort of thing. And so they all went to that museum, and the museum started selling tickets. And then suddenly the museum next door said, oh, we've got one as well. We just happened to find it in the attic,
Yeah.
And suddenly there are Iron Maidens everywhere, and some of them are really well made. They look fantastic. Some of them are partially really medieval. For instance, the outside, it's really a person-shaped box, for instance. But when you then say, is it really medieval? And some of the museums are brave enough to actually do scientific tests on their objects in their collection. And then museums have checked them and said, yeah, okay, well, the box is medieval, yay. But the spikes are, guess what, 19th century. There is a suspicious large amount of medieval torture devices in museums and collections to this day, and not all with notes saying that they're perhaps not real, that are actually Victorian, made by someone who wanted to make a quick buck.
Yeah. And well, that also brings up perhaps the most exaggerated thing ever, and that is the chastity belt.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very funny. The interesting thing with the chastity belts, if you stop and think about it for a little bit, suddenly it makes no sense whatsoever. Because you put that on your wife when you don't want her to have fun with the stable boy when you go out crusading. Crusades can last years.
Yeah.
Years. Can you imagine what will happen to a human being who has to wear metal on their skin for years that they can't take off? That is going to go wrong.
Yeah.
If you return from the Crusades, your wife is going to be either dead or it's going to be, but you don't want to know what happened to underneath the clothing. That's not going to work. It's a terrible idea. And also, if you have one of those chastity belts, there is not a smith in the country that you can pay a couple of coins to and say, can you unlock this for me?
Well, yeah. That would be hardly really secure, right?
Yeah. Padlocks, medieval padlocks, they were massive. But that's not going to work very well either. But it's not going to stop anyone who really, really wants to have a bit of fun from having a bit of fun. And when you then start to look at the evidence for them, the oldest we have is one vague medieval description that says, well, don't go to that place because the women there wear iron underpants, something like that, which is more likely a bit of a joke of, them being prudish or you not having a chance with them anyway.
Yeah.
It's quite obvious, but that again, people love the idea, especially the Victorians again, of course, because violence and sex and the Middle Ages, that's a combination they just couldn't resist. So it's a wonderful story for them. They loved it. And again, just like with the Iron Maiden, suddenly there was this guy who says, yeah, I've got one.
Yeah.
It's real. It's real.
Yeah.
It's been in my cupboard for centuries. Yeah, I didn't know. No. Yeah, of course you can buy it.
Yeah.
And suddenly all the museums had one. Yeah, and then suddenly it started to lead its own life. And again, some brave museums, and of course also museums who have that budget, said, well, let's test them. And some of them were really upset because they had, the chastity belts of famous medieval women in their collection. They had to admit, yeah, it's Victorian. And then they quietly remove it from their collection.
Yeah.
With a lot less media attention than when they first put it in the collection, of course.
Or some places actually have displays of, look, these are artifacts from the Victorian era, trying to show the Middle Ages in a certain way.
Yes.
And so that in itself becomes a historical.
Yes, exactly. That is the perfect response, because that makes the object more interesting as far as I'm concerned. I love that so much. They've done it with vampire hunting kits. They've done
Yeah,
it, you know,
yeah,
and instead of quietly removing it, they put it in a glass box with a note saying, "This is a fake. It's gorgeous. It's fantastic." And people
yeah,
still go and say, "Oh, wow, it's
yeah.
beautiful." And it's a fake. They love it. It becomes even more interesting. You know, you could have a museum full of fake history objects, and that would be a fantastic place to go to.
Well, all of these sort of coalesce, or there a lot of them are symbolized nicely for me in the Lady Godiva myths. I've first of all, chastity and purity, and the relations between an elite man and his wife, and all that sort of thing. And we have the vision that Lady Godiva was so upset by, went to her husband and said, "You're overtaxing our peasants. They're complaining, blah, blah, blah. What, can you please stop this?" And he said, "I will." I mean, this is a very intense summary of all this. "I won't reduce the taxes unless you ride naked through the center of town." And this town is Coventry. But of course, all of that is a myth. So please tell us, what do we know about Lady Godiva? And by the way, and do you think that the Lady Godiva myth brings in almost all of these medieval myths?
Well, the funny thing is, this Lady Godiva, she was a lady. She had power. She was an important person. She had land of her own. She owned much of the land that these taxes were related to. So she didn't have to ask her husband anything. I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking about the early Middle Ages, not the late Middle Ages, not the Renaissance. This was a time when women still had some some things to say for themselves. You know, they still had some actual power. And she was given her rights from the royals, from the king himself. So there was no issue to begin with. The taxes were about horses. Well, horses, except farm horses, were a very elite object. They, they were a massive investment, even for a farmer. Most people didn't have a horse, so it was already for a small amount of people involved, not all the poor peasants. On top of that, at that time, Coventry was a small village, not a city. So
Yeah.
even if she did it, even if she had ridden around, it would have been like 3 people who saw her and go, what's she doing?" I mean, it's not, everyone else would be working, busy in the fields. No, it wasn't a town, it wasn't a city, it was a village. So the whole story already makes no sense. The story is probably based on her and her husband both being actually pretty decent people who didn't want to raise too high taxes, who cared about their pet. They were popular. They were doing, there were no revolutions. People were happy about them.
Yeah.
It may have started with something as simple as saying, let's not raise any taxes. and people going,
Right.
"Oh, that's nice." And then people adding to that. Even if there was some sort of event where she rode through the city naked, or the town, the village, which probably didn't, but even if it did, it may have been her riding somewhere in a hurry and not putting on one item of clothing, for instance, a veil or a cloak. And people saying, "Wow, she's in a hurry. She didn't even put a cloak on, or a coat, or a jacket," as we would say today, which is sort of a bit naked. And then that getting completely out of hand. That's where it all started. And the funny thing is that the story is old. It started in the Middle Ages, but the story started by someone describing exactly what she and he, the Lord and Lady, were saying to each other. And he wrote this about 200 years after it happened.
Yeah, yeah,
So, this writer, was he a time traveler who then hid behind some curtains as he overheard it all? I mean, it's so obviously just a story that was made up and then got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a fun story. It's a lovely story. They've got a massive statue of her in Coventry, naked on her horse.
yeah.
Again, there's no real evidence for anything even remotely like it ever happening.
Well, and there are these beautiful Victorian era paintings, and they themselves are massive, and they're reproduced, and it's not surprising that the myth just gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced.
Yeah, if you meet a Victorian and you say, "I've got a story for you," he says, "Oh, tell me
Ah,
more."
oh,
And he
there you
says,
go. Yeah,
"It's medieval." "Oh, yes, please. It has nudity in it." "Oh my God, tell me more. I love it already. Let's go make a statue."
yeah, 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 yeah.
That's how you hook them in. And so many of the wonderful Victorian myths, they're all about the same, and they tell us so much about the Victorians. and
Yeah.
not about the medieval people. And unfortunately, that's a problem history has throughout
Sure.
mankind's story. Any history, even up to today, when you ask historians to write about a theme, quite often it tells us a lot about today,
Right.
and also about history, but also a lot about today, because we're only humans, so we can't help but see the past through the glasses that we have on today, our modern views. So we can't shut those out. So we always have this perspective. But the Victorians, they were pushing their luck. They were going way over the top with it. They were building fake castles and things like that. And
Sure.
yeah, and ruins and in their own gardens. And then people started believing that was a real castle, and they just loved their history, and I'm perfectly fine with it. But yeah, the stories are insane.
Well, we have only scratched the surface of, half a dozen of the 101 myths that are in your wonderful book, 101 Things That Never Happened. So please, Buzzkillers, go to the Buzzkill bookshelf, look up, you'll see right there in the blog post for this episode, The Fake History Hunters, 101 Things That Never Happened in History. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for being on the show.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
It took us a while to get it all organized, and we had a failed Zoom meeting.
Yeah,
we had
you had your medieval microphone.
Yeah, that's right. So it all worked out in the end, Buzzkillers, and we want all of you again to get the book ASAP, and please come back on the show when your next book comes out.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
We'll talk to all the rest of you out there next week.